and welcome to Round Robin. I'm your host, Robin McCormick with the City of Hampton, and today we're going to talk about the history of one of our really special neighborhoods in Hampton. It's the Old Wythe area. My guest is the author of a book about the history, Greg Siegel. Welcome.
Welcome, and thank you for having me.
Now, I asked you when you first got here, are you an old, long-time family descendant of Old Wythe? And the answer is?
No.
Well, I'm surprised. I would have thought, that kind of thing would be passed down. You're a newbie.
I'm a newbie. I came to Old Wythe in Hampton in 2000.
Oh, very newbie.
Very newbie.
Okay.
And I have a sense of community, and I was brought up by my parents that way, who was very involved in their community with me growing up. And with the neighborhood, my first job was working for a Wythe hardware store.
Oh, okay. That's an old-timey, a lot of people coming in.
Exactly,
yeah.
which is, unfortunately, it's closed right now.
Right.
But with managing that, I have a lot of customers coming in who lived in the neighborhood, of course, being a neighborhood hardware store, and they would tell me all about this history and what used to be there and folklore and things like that. And at the same time, I've joined the Old Wythe Neighborhood Association, which is a volunteer neighborhood association that helps bridge the gap between homeowners and the city. Mm-hmm. And we also try to bring people together through our events that we do during the course of the year. So I got heavily involved in the association, and through that, there's always been talk about preserving history in Old Wythe because we do go back to, basically the Indians that used our area for hunting and fishing and farming. So hearing the stories at the hardware store and getting involved in the neighborhood association at the same time, and hearing talk at the board meetings, we should do our history. Well, in 2001, a gentleman named Mike McHenry moved to Old Wythe, and he's a very large, very big history buff. And we kind of hooked up, and we kind of said, we're tired of hearing we should. We need to do it. And we both had the same philosophy that if we don't put our history down on paper, it's going to be gone.
Right.
It's not going to be saved for future generations. And we searched back in 7 years ago when we put out our first book, Hampton's Old Wythe by Arcadia. We searched for photographs and memories, and we put that book together, and it was a very sold out book. We sold over 2,500 copies.
That is really good for a local neighborhood association.
It is, it really is. Talking with the Arcadia folks, that they were not prepared to see the sales that we've had with that first book. Right now it's out of print, but the Neighborhood Association, our plans are to go back and print up a couple hundred copies with that. Because of the introduction of the new book, people are now asking for the first volume, or book one.
That's right, and they're very different. This one is mostly photographs and snippets. It's kind of the thing you could pick up and turn to and flip through from time to time, and you don't have to read it cover to cover. Exactly.
What we wanted to do is...
Let me get you to hold that one up
sure.
so people can see it.
Sure.
Okay.
The first book was meant to preserve images. Mm-hmm. Talk to a lot of folks, go through their photographs, and we had a team about 12 people on this first committee, and we would go through photographs and try to tell the story as best we could within the process of Arcadia. They have a format. You just have to stay with the format. So
this is a history press company. That's kind of what they do.
Exactly. So we did this 7 years ago, and in 2013, 2014 that we're in, it became the 20th anniversary of the Neighborhood Association. So Mike, who's a good friend of mine, and he came to me and said, we need to do another book for the 20th anniversary of the association. And I told him, I said, well, if we're going to do a book, I want to do it about words and tell the stories. I don't want to do another picture book. And so we reached out to History Press, who's a sister company of Arcadia, and got with them and say, what's the format? What do we have to do? We have a successful book one. They were on board right away because of the success of the first book, and we set out to write the book. We have, I want to look because I don't want to, we have how many chapters? We have 11 chapters in this book, and it's a total of about 44,000 words and about 40 pictures.
That's great.
So it's a complete opposite of our first book, but if you put the two together, and you read the chapters.
You need both volumes.
You go back to and you see some more photos of the things we're talking about. And what the words able to do is tell the true story, factual stories. And again, like I said earlier, me and Mike, we wanted to preserve our history, and the best way to do it is put it into a book.
Well, let's talk about some of the different points in the history of Wythe. And first of all, let's define for people. I think the Neighborhood Association considers Old Wythe to be Kecoughtan to Chesapeake.
Correct.
And LaSalle to Pear.
To Pear,
to
right.
write the Newport News City line.
Right.
So it's one of our largest neighborhoods in the city.
Over 1,400 homes are
big.
within that district.
Okay.
And that district was, people always ask, how did Old Wythe become Old Wythe, and why isn't it just a Wythe, and things like that. But it happened way back with the city neighborhood initiative, where neighborhood folks that are interested in preserving and things. That was back in '93, '92. They started to have meetings, and the city really wanted to define neighborhoods, have some ownership within neighborhoods, with an association or a civic group, and the boundaries were set up during that time, and it was just based on how many people, how many houses within a district. It wasn't anything else. So a couple years later, after it became formally as the Wythe Neighborhood Association, then it became Old Wythe Neighborhood Association, and the board of directors at the time, I think it was 98, 96, decided to separate themselves from the rest of the Wythe area.
Because a lot of people would define the Wythe area as maybe on the other side of Kecoughtan up to Victoria. Some people maybe even would say up to Shell. Kind of all developed at about the same time and had some of the same characteristics.
Well, back in 1700s, okay.
All right, so 1700s, what does Wythe look like?
Wythe was huge. It was the largest district within Elizabeth City County, which is now Hampton. And the district ran from the Hampton Harbor all the way up to the Back River Creek.
Okay.
And
wow.
Up on top of Langley.
Wow,
okay?
That's most of the county at that point. It was almost two-thirds of the side.
It was almost two-thirds of the county.
Oh.
Okay. The Phoebus side was called the Chesapeake District back then. And then through the course of life, happens and changes happens. The Wythe district ended up shrinking to around Pembroke 664.
Okay. From
LaSalle Avenue to the city line. And that was called the Wythe district. And within the Wythe district, you have many different neighborhood associations. Right. You have the Wythe Phoenix Neighborhood Association, you have our association, and there's like 4 others that are formed and acknowledged by the city as a neighborhood association.
Okay, so you're talking about 17. Was it a plantation, multiple plantations?
Well,
what did we look like?
Well, but back in the 1700s, we were flat ground. We had a lot of trees.
We're still pretty flat.
Right. But we were underwater. We had a lot of creeks running through the Wythe area.
Right.
During heavy rains or storm surges, we had a lot of mud, as they would say.
You've got Indian Creek and Robinson Creek still, but I would guess they've been a little hemmed in.
They've been hemmed in. We looked at some maps and if you drive, the Old Wythe area, you go down Shenandoah, those streets, you take a little dip. Towards this, when you go from Kecoughtan Road to the water, you go down past Kenmore, you go dip.
Yep.
Well, that little dip was a creek.
Ah.
Okay, and that was usually muddy, and you had saturation, and then when it would rain, you would get more muddy and more wet and more water, standing water. That really was an offshoot of Indian River Creek. The creek kind of ran all the way through the neighborhood at one time, but because of building and this and that. The creek is pretty well hemmed in, as you said before. We did have probably the largest plantation in Elizabeth City County called Seeley Plantation, and that was in the early 1700s. It was bordered from Orchard Avenue in Old Wythe all the way over to the little boat harbor in Newport News, which was also part of Elizabeth City County back in the day.
Okay.
So the plantation, Seeley Plantation, grew to over 1,500 acres. It shrunk down to 700 acres and in between all that. And it's one of the plantations in the state that can be traced from the early beginnings for the first owner of the plantation all the way through when the plantation was sold off after the Civil War. There's not a lot of plantations that you can actually use the deeds that were done and can trace everybody who was part of that plantation and the families and things like that. So it's really cool.
So how does Wythe get from plantation to pretty dense neighborhood? There was a period of time, I would assume, when there was a giant building boom going on.
It was a building boom in decades. It didn't all happen all at one time.
Okay.
In the book, we have a chapter in here. What that chapter is called. It's called How We Became Old Wythe.
All right.
And it's a pretty long chapter, and we go into how the neighborhood is broken up into thirds, into fourth. So we have distinct neighborhoods or streets within the neighborhood, and that's because different people developed at different time. The first concentration of homes was done where the Seeley Plantation is, from Orchard all the way down into the Newport News line, what is now Newport News, and that was developed as in the 1880s.
Okay.
Old Dominion Land Company bought the Seeley property, and
was it along the water, along Chesapeake?
Well, it wasn't. The Seeley Plantation was narrow and long. So the waterfront area from Orchard to the small boat harbor, Newport News, was very small in terms of width, but it was very deep.
Okay.
So what happened was, after the Civil War, you have issues there. Finally, in the 1880s, the Old Dominion Land Company bought the land from the last owner of the track, and they decided, based on the growth of the shipyard and the growth of Newport News, and so they decided to sell off lots, and people came and built their homes. And what it came out to be is, you got to think of little farms, because you have to think of 1880s. You got to think of, well, there's no grocery stores, there's no 7-Elevens, there's no, people had chickens and goats and horses and mules for transportation. So they sold off 3-4 lots at a time. Somebody would build their house for their large family, usually 6 or 8 kids or so, and so they would farm around their house for their food, and then the father usually worked at the shipyard.
And there was a transportation system, a road or a streetcar? How did they get to the shipyard?
It was all based on, back then, the streetcar was just forming in Hampton, but you had to get to the streetcar. There was no streetcar line at the time going through the Chesapeake Avenue, or I call it the Boulevard, which was the old name for it. The streetcar came in 1905.
Okay.
That did spur more growth. And in 1916, the second largest neighborhood was formed, and it was called the Indian River Creek. And that's formed around Indian River like we have today.
Powhatan, Pocahontas, all those
areas. Right.
Yeah.
And then going, I guess we're going west, okay, towards the city. That was a golf course. And all that land from Hampton Roads Avenue to East Avenue was a golf course. It was 10 acres. It was a 9-hole golf course, and we go into the history of the golf course in the book. And the golf course closed in 1920. It was Armstrong property, the Armstrongs, as a name for all of Hampton to know. And they saw the need for more houses. And so they broke the lease with the golf course, and they started selling off their lots. In 1922, 3, 4, for home lots. And that's what we have now at Hampton Roads Avenue, Shenandoah.
A lot of those are from the 20s and 30s.
Are the 20s, right. Then by the 40s, you have the development, late 30s, early 40s, had development around Robinson Park.
Okay.
That's the last major building area that was left to build on. And that was controlled by Captain Robinson and a few of his investors. And they developed streets, and they built smaller homes. And all of these homes from Indian River all the way down to Pear, were folks that worked at the shipyard. They worked other type of manual labor positions and things like that. By the 20s and 30s, the houses that were from Indian River all the way over to LaSalle, most of those were more the white-collar folks. And there we had the presidents of banks living here. We had the vice presidents of the shipyard living here. We had a lot of NASA engineers living in an Old Wythe. So we had that mix of demographics that you really don't see, where you have a lot of different people melting together.
True. There's a big price range when you start looking in Old Wythe.
Correct. And of course, in the early days, if we go back to the development of the Boulevard, Captain Robinson, McMimmons, of the crab industry, they had homes along there.
And plants. There were seafood plants along the water,
the Robinson
which we forget about now.
Right. The Robinson had their crab industry set up and going, and then they spun out into bricks, and they would make their bricks down shipping out of a river, and then they would barge them up and they would sell them out of Hampton. So we had a lot going. The streetcar, we spoke about that, ran from '05. It came and it lasted till the '33 hurricane. And by then we had buses and things like that. But having the streetcar, able to open up more doors. They took the streetcar to Buckrow. They took the streetcar to Fort Monroe, and it all had to pass the Wythe area. So when people are on the streetcar, they're passing the Wythe area, they, hey, I might want to live here and move out of the city or out of apartments. And so, that was kind of a free advertisement for our neighborhood and using the water and enjoying the waters that we have and things like that.
Well, I think, it is such a robust neighborhood, and there is so much diversity in the houses. You can buy a less expensive house, you can buy $1 million house. I mean, there's great range there, and there's enough of a mass that it truly has this coherence and history. And I think, the neighborhood association and some of the institutions there, the pool, the Little League, the Cub Scout troops, I mean, there's long-term history there in terms of the community and the people, in addition to the older history.
Well, the reason for that is a lot of kids that are have moved back and either moved into their parents' home or come back because they loved the neighborhood growing up. And they had a great time in the neighborhood. They had it was just wonderful growing up there. So they wanted to come back and be part of that.
It is true. I know we're members of the pool, and so many of those kids, their parents swam at the pool, and their grandparents, come back to coach, and they remember all that kind of stuff. It's just really neat that you have that generational tie, and that those of us who are newbies, because I didn't grow up there, but I lived in Wythe for quite a while, feel that. It's like we're welcomed into the community right away.
Right, and that's how we want to be. The association, I think, works very hard trying to have events to bring things around. We just had our fall festival last weekend. We bring a band in. We have things for adults and things for kids to do. The next event is a gingerbread making day where kids can sign up, parents can sign up for their kids, and they go to Van Casas on a Saturday morning and they build their gingerbread house. That's becoming a tradition over the last few years, doing that. But the association work hard, is very active.
There's Easter egg hunts. There's always a lot going on in that area.
And the history committee, is part of that. And part of having a sense of community is knowing our history and preserving our history.
And I'm going to say, it's technically outside the neighborhood just a little bit. Van Costas has become a little bit the center for the Wythe neighborhood. They sell your book.
Yes.
And they can also get it from the neighborhood association and some bookstores, the History Museum. There's other places you can get it too.
Definitely. It's not just you can't buy. You don't place to buy a book out of the back of my car. But using a publisher like History Press, it's a distributor network, and doing books, you have to have a distributor to get your book out there.
Right.
And that's why we chose History Press or Arcadia to be able to get the book out there. When you do a self-published book, it's hard to get on the shelves.
You need some help.
And things like that.
But as you say, if you buy it directly from the neighborhood association, we get a little bit bigger cut there,
We do. And people say, well, but the book is a cost to us, is the same cost to the bookstore, but the bookstore needs to make their money just as like anything else. But when you buy a book from myself or Mike or a member of the Old Wythe Neighborhood Association, the money goes back to the history in preserving more history. And
well, great, Greg, and thank you so much for coming by today. And I hope people will take a look at the books. I know I'm going to, especially when the photo one gets back in reprint. And I hope people will also then take a little bit more look at that neighborhood, because it is such a rich and diverse neighborhood with a lot of history and a lot still going on. Sometimes in Hampton, we sit back and rest on our history and don't keep that neighborhood feel. But I think that's one of the things that really works about Wythe.
Well, thank you.
So thank you for coming by. And thank you for watching. I hope you've learned a little bit more about Old Wythe, and we'll take a little driving tour or look at the book or spend a little time there. Thanks for watching.